studying UFOs and nuclear bases. For those of you who are unfamiliar with Robert Hastings, let me give a little bit of background on him. Robert Hastings was born at Sandia Base, New Mexico, May 6, 1950, during a period of high UFO activity at the base and nearby Kirtland Air Force Base. His father, Sergeant Robert E. Hastings, was career Air Force, and the Hastings family were stationed at Malmstrom Air Force Base in 1966 to 67 during one of the peak periods of UFO activity at nearby ICBM sites. That's what sparked his interest in UFOs. He received his BFA in photography at Ohio University in 1972. He almost completed a master's program in instructional technology, media directed toward educational ends, but gave that up in 1981 to go out on the college lecture circuit to speak on the UFO nukes connection. Thus far, he has spoken at over 500 colleges and universities nationwide. In 1986 to 1988, he retrained in electron microscopy at San Joaquin Delta College in Stockton, California, and received a certificate in material science applications. Between 1988 and 2002, he was employed as a laboratory analyst by Phillips Semiconductors in Albuquerque, New Mexico, but continued to lecture at colleges part-time, averaging 25 to 30 programs per year. He is currently semi-retired, but still lectures on UFOs. Unfortunately, Robert does not have a website, but if you go to the page where you found this interview at banalofamerica.com, you'll find 3 great links to articles written by Robert Hastings that we discussed throughout this interview. You can link up to those at the page, and you'll be able to get tons more material from Robert Hastings regarding his research. Without any further ado, let's rock and roll, folks. This interview was recorded on May 30th, 2007. Robert Hastings talking about the UFO nukes connection on Banal of America Audio, Season 2. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another edition of Banal of America Audio. This week our guest is Robert Hastings, who has been studying the UFO phenomenon for over 30 years. He's just done an amazing amount of work, and he's focused on the UFO nukes connection, nuclear weapons that is, and the strange situation with UFO sightings over nuclear bases, not just in America, but also all over the world, and what's going on with that connection. And that's what we're going to talk about with Robert Hastings, and we're also going to find out a little bit about his travels in the world of ufology over the years and how he thinks things are shaping up in the UFO field. So, welcome to the show, Robert.
Thank you.
Well, let's start out first, obviously, with your bio and your background, how you gravitated toward the UFO subject in the first place.
My father was career Air Force, and in 1966 and 67, he was stationed at Malmstrom Air Force Base, Montana. Many of your listeners probably already know that there were a number of now well-publicized UFO sightings at the base Minuteman nuclear weapons sites during that period. I happened to actually see 5 UFOs on radar, 5 targets. At the time, I was 16 going on 17 and worked as a custodian in the base air traffic control tower. And I did actually witness with my own eyes, according to the FAA controller who was talking to me, that these objects were clearly not aircraft and that jet fighters had been launched to investigate. When I excitedly mentioned all of this to my father, he made inquiries, unbeknownst to me actually, but later told me that there was confirmation, probably third hand at that point, that indeed these were bona fide UFOs maneuvering near silos, missile installations out at a location called Judith Basin, a county with a number of missile silos. So that was my introduction to the subject. I was quite fascinated and intrigued by what I witnessed and what I was subsequently told. And by 1973, I was enamored enough of the subject that I decided to begin interviewing former and retired Air Force personnel regarding their own experiences, not only at Malmstrom, but at other Air Force bases. I was interested in any type of incident involving UFOs, but very quickly came to focus on sightings involving nuclear weapons.
What made you decide to focus on that nuclear aspect? Obviously, people who follow the UFO phenomenon know about how intricate that is to the UFO phenomenon, but a lot of people, it's sort of under the radar, no pun intended, I guess. in the mainstream, really, I guess. But what made you focus on the nuclear aspect of the UFO phenomenon?
Well, it seemed to me self-evident that, especially for anyone who grew up in the Cold War era, that the threat of nuclear war seemed to always be hanging over our heads. I remember in elementary school and even high school at Air Force bases having regular atomic bomb drills, nuclear bomb drills, where we would have to duck under desks. I think that went on nationwide, especially during the 1950s. So there was always this threat that we were going to engage in thermonuclear war with the Soviet Union and, conceivably could end human civilization if indeed something like that transpired. So the fact that UFOs seem to be interested in nosing around, surveilling whatever, our nuclear weapons seemed to me very significant. And very quickly I came to the conclusion that probably one of the primary reasons that UFO sightings accelerated dramatically post-World War II was the fact that we had nuclear weapons. By probably the mid-'70s, I became aware of the writings of Captain Edward Ruppelt, who was the first chief of Project Blue Book. In his book, published in 1956, The Report on Unidentified Flying Objects, Ruppelt made a number of explicit statements about UFOs flying around nuclear weapons sites ranging from the Los Alamos Nuclear Weapons Lab to Sandia Base in Albuquerque, where coincidentally I was born, and other nuclear weapons-related facilities, the Oak Ridge National Laboratories, where weapons-grade uranium and plutonium was produced, where also at the Hanford site in Washington, where plutonium was produced for nuclear weapons. So even the Air Force was very aware of and concerned by nuclear weapons-related sightings as of the late 1940s and early 50s. So it seemed to me that whatever else UFOs are up to, one of the principal themes, the more and more I dug into it, it seemed to be involving nuclear weapons.
And you said you started in 73 starting to interview these whistleblowers, for lack of a better term. How did you find people to speak out on what they saw while they were in the military? That sounds like it would be a hard nut to crack. So how did you find these people, and then, how did you go about figuring out what they had to say?
Well, you're absolutely correct. I would say, 1 out of 20 or 1 out of 50 people actually had something significant to say to me. However, given that my background was Air Force, in the fact that my dad was career, I had a number of acquaintances through him and other persons I came into contact with who had Air Force backgrounds, of course, either active duty or retired. So I just began informally asking questions of people. Not surprisingly, most of the people I spoke with had no knowledge of anything involving UFOs, or at least that's what they told me. I think most of them were sincere. My gut told me clearly that some of them were being deceptive, but I viewed that as their prerogative, and I didn't really push the issue with rare exceptions. At some point in time, there began to be a groundswell of responses, probably by about the mid-'70s, where people were discussing with me their knowledge of one incident or another involving UFOs. Radar operators were discussing objects being tracked that could not be identified as aircraft by their velocities, their erratic maneuvers. Some cases, objects performing maneuvers that no aircraft on Earth could match. So the people who were telling me these stories were quite impressed themselves by what they had witnessed. I also began discussing or asking persons with a knowledge of nuclear weapons cases to elaborate as to their knowledge of these events. These people were very tight-lipped, with rare exceptions, but at some point when I began summarizing formally my interviews and providing these people with the interview summaries, a number of them seemed to be relieved that other people were talking about these events, and more or less went on the record, either more or less specifically. And I'm talking about, at this point, several hundred persons, former and retired Air Force personnel, by this point in time, 2007, who've discussed various issues with me. Some of the individuals are extremely explicit. For example, then Lieutenant Robert Salas was a nuclear missile launch officer at Malmstrom Air Force Base during the same period when my dad was there. Salas has gone online with his research associate Jim Klotz and have just laid out chapter and verse what occurred at Malmstrom at his particular launch control facility. Salas was underground with his co-commander, and when they got a frantic call from a guard topside at ground level saying, "Sir, there's a UFO hovering over the site," Salas has said he thought this was a joke and was kind of indignant that this guard would make jokes over this very secure line. And he said, "Well, just, keep me informed." Minutes later, the same guard called back and was frantic, if not scared, and said, "Sir, it's directly over the site, and one of the guards has been injured. Salas said he had not even the time to wake up his co-commander to explain what was going on, when suddenly on their missile readiness display panel in the underground launch capsule, they observed that one by one, the 10 Minuteman missiles that they themselves controlled would launch in the time of war began to malfunction one after the other, what the Air Force calls dropping off alert status. Long story short, Salas was debriefed by what's called OSI, the Office of Special Investigations, was sworn to secrecy, and did not tell his story until 1995 when he began working with Jim Klotz. So that's the type of incident that I've heard about from not only Salas but other individuals, objects hovering directly over nuclear missile launch control facilities. In some instances, not all, but in some instances, missiles malfunction immediately thereafter. Interestingly, the missile maintenance personnel I've talked to have described cases where apparently targeting tapes or other types of targeting technology has been scrambled in effect, and following these incidents requiring sometimes the complete removal of those particular missiles and replacement with others. So obviously this is some very dramatic stuff, and these sources are persons that the U.S. government has entrusted with the launching of nuclear weapons or the guarding of nuclear weapons, the maintenance of nuclear weapons, persons who are given psychological tests, persons who are considered obviously trustworthy in these very dramatic circumstances of launching missiles in time of war, potentially killing millions of people. I mean, these are people who are not your average Joe on the street, and they're speaking of incidents involving UFOs hovering above their missiles, and in some cases apparently tampering with their missiles' functionality. So, in my view, this is self-evidently important and something that I've just really devoted my adult life to investigating.
Exactly, yeah. Well, kudos to you for compiling that many solid witnesses. Those are witnesses of good stock, as you say. These aren't the proverbial farmer in the hayfield. These are legit people who, how can you not believe? And I see also that you've sort of tried to supplement some of your witness testimony with freedom of information requests and document type searches. It sounds like that's the sort of thing that's actually not too easy, because these sort of things are kind of scrubbed from the record. How easy or hard is it to get information via the government regarding these incidents?
I began filing freedom of information requests in the early 1980s, and what I found very quickly is that my responses were essentially no response at all. I tried to get Air Force Office of Special Investigations records based on the testimony of my sources saying that on such and such a date at such and such a base this incident occurred, and I was debriefed by OSI. Well, according to OSI, in response to my freedom of information requests, they had zero documents relating to the incidents that I was petitioning for. They basically had the blanket statement, all files, OSI files relating to UFO sightings were declassified when Project Blue Book files were declassified. That is not the case. And so what I've decided to do over the years is concentrate on the witness interviews, simply because I just think that I'm not going to get anywhere else, some of my research associates, Jim Klotz, for example, has filed FOIA requests on my behalf. He's gotten nowhere with OSI and other agencies that might have a knowledge of these nuclear weapons-related cases. So we think the stonewalling is such that we're not going to get anywhere, basically. Nevertheless, over the years, Dr. Bruce Maccabee, for example, succeeded in getting a number of FBI documents relating to nuclear weapons cases that the FBI were privy to back in the late 40s and early 50s, pretty much before they were cut out by the Air Force. There was a lot of sharing of information about the early UFO sightings in New Mexico at the Los Alamos labs, Sandia labs in Albuquerque, other Oak Ridge, Hanford, other sites, and the documents also clearly indicate that CIA took an interest, a strong interest, and perhaps even a controlling interest in these types of events. But the record, the paperwork, the paper trail is fragmentary. What is known is pretty hit or miss, and events from about the mid-'60s on, early '60s even, the paper trail just dries up, with rare exceptions involving the nuclear weapons-related cases. So it's a very tightly guarded secret. It obviously has national security-related implications, and I think the Pentagon and the intelligence agencies who are monitoring the situation, gathering the data, and suppressing the data have just concluded that, all of this will be beyond freedom of information release.
Yeah. And we had a special episode actually about a month ago with Paul Kimball. He did a cable special, 10 best UFO cases, and a lot of them were one of them obviously was the Malmstrom one, and many of them also were kind of in this vein with military type witnesses and radar returns and that kind of thing. And obviously these must be the cream of the crop, so I can see why the government would want to keep them under wraps.
I think that's true. I think there are any number of sources who are willing to come forward and talk about what they know, but again, backing it up with documentation has been extremely difficult.
Yeah.
Bob Salas, by the way, the gentleman I mentioned who was at Malmstrom Air Force Base in '67, is going to be one of the key speakers at the MUFON conference in Denver in August. And I strongly recommend that anybody attending the conference attend Mr. Salas's lecture, because he will stick to the nuts and bolts. He obviously has credentials, and whereas a lot of other research into UFOs involves a great deal of speculation, Mr. Salas will just tell you chapter and verse what occurred to him and what took place. There are, to my knowledge, at least 5 other former or retired missile launch officers at Malmstrom who've also gone on the record about the incidents that Mr. Salas is willing to describe. All of them are pretty reticent. They're certainly not as willing to go full out as Mr. Salas is in terms of publicizing their experiences, but they have gone on the record as to those experiences occurring and their knowledge of them. For example, I about 5 or 6 years ago interviewed a man named, Bob Jameson, who was at the time of the Malmstrom incidents a missile targeting officer, who was actually in charge of making sure that in time of war the missiles would land where they were designated to land. He said that he was personally involved in at least 2 separate UFO-related missile shutdowns where large numbers of Minuteman missiles malfunctioned simultaneously, precisely at a time, just moments later after reports of UFOs above their positions came in to the launch officers. And, so these are persons that have some credentials, obviously know what they're talking about, and they're willing to go on the record finally about these things occurring. And
how do you overcome the problem? We've talked about this on the show with ufologists, especially people who work with the whistleblowers, of ufology sort of turning on the whistleblowers or putting them through the ringer And a lot of times, the whistleblower at the end of the day will be like, it wasn't worth it because I came up forward with this thing, and then the UFO people completely turned on me. Obviously, you don't do that. You're trying to find the whistleblowers. But I mean, how do you deal with that cannibalistic attitude of ufology?
Well, when I'm interviewing the persons I talk to, the sources that I uncover, on occasion just drop in my lap, I myself put them through a rigorous series of questions. I require that they provide their service records to me, substantiating their presence in these squadrons at those bases at the time of the incidents. And I have any number of very probing questions that I ask each and every one of them just to satisfy my own sense that they know what they're talking about and that they're credible. So I make it clear to them that, if they're willing to go on the record with me, and if I'm going to publish what they're saying with their permission, then they've got to be able to substantiate as best as possible what they're telling me.
Yeah.
Beyond that, as far as the response of ufology in general or the public in general to these cases, years ago I just adopted the posture of taking what comes, because the whole process has a life of itself. Popular perceptions of UFOs, skeptics and debunkers' perceptions of UFOs, and all of that is nothing that's going to be significantly modified. I think there will always be controversy associated with this subject until once and for all the reality of UFOs is demonstrated beyond any doubt. So I don't let it worry me, or I'm not concerned by the fact that some people will always doubt the validity of this data.
Before I did the research, I had a question for you, and then when I started doing it, it actually sort of answered my question, and that it was that it seemed like these nuclear sightings happened a lot in the past and weren't happening nowadays. But then when I read your report here, let me give the address for the report for people. Get a pen and paper, folks. Here it is. www.nicap.org/babylon/missile_incidents.htm, and we'll have a link at the page where you find the interview. So hopefully you'll be able to get to the site that we're talking about here that has a paper published by Robert. You have a compendium there of a lot of key cases and sightings all over nuclear bases. And what I found interesting and answered the question was one of the first that I had when we were planning the interview was about this later time period of UFO over nuke-based sightings, is that there seems to have been a series of sightings in the 90s over Malmstrom Air Force Base and a few other ones. This isn't a phenomenon that came and went in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. It's still kind of going on.
Well, what I found, if one goes online and tries to search Google, for example, for nuclear weapons-related UFO cases, as far as the ICBM cases, the nuclear missile cases, almost probably 80%, just off the top of my head. The majority of the material relates to the incidents that were reported at Malmstrom Air Force Base in 1967. However, what I have found and other researchers have found who dug into this in depth is that indeed this is an ongoing situation. Nuclear missiles came online, began to be deployed around 1960, depending on how you use the benchmarks that have been published. But operationally, nuclear missiles took hold were deployed right around 1960. And I have discovered that even the first generation of nuclear missiles that we use, the Atlas missiles, were visited by UFOs at a number of bases, including Walker Air Force Base in Roswell, New Mexico, F.E. Warren Air Force Base outside of Cheyenne, Wyoming, and other Atlas bases. So from the get-go, when missiles came online, they were being visited by disc-shaped objects. The article, the online article you just referenced of mine, I have, I think, 5 or 6 individuals, launch officers and missile maintenance personnel at Walker Air Force Base, describing saucer-shaped objects hovering over nuclear missile silos, racing away instantaneously at high velocity, and then instantaneously stopping over adjacent missile silos. That information comes from a launch officer named retired Lieutenant Colonel Philip Moore, and so he's one of the people who's gone online about it. Another former launch officer, then Lieutenant Jerry Nelson, has talked about at this one site he was at, site number 9, Atlas site number 9, repeatedly over about a month. He estimated somewhere around half a dozen to a dozen instances where an unlit object hovered silently and directly over the missile silo, but shone a bright light down on it before racing away. And he said the guards were just panic-stricken by this. They couldn't explain what was going on. So the types of events that have been reported at Malmstrom in the late 60s were preceded by events at other bases in the earlier generations of nuclear missile deployment. As you mentioned, I've also interviewed persons, missile maintenance personnel, and others who were involved at Malmstrom with nuclear missiles in the mid-1990s. And indeed, they're reporting virtually the same kinds of instances that were going on 2 decades, 3 decades earlier. So this is an ongoing process. My opinion, based on what I know of all this after this many years of researching it, is that probably within the last year, somewhere at some nuclear missile base, there was an incident of this type. But it will probably take years for persons to come forward after they've left the Air Force, after they've left active duty, who are willing to discuss these incidents. So there's always this built-in, generally speaking, delay factor. Mm-hmm. But yes, indeed, there are a number of instances of these types of events occurring at various bases in the 1990s.
And then one of the cases that you seem to have paid a little bit of extra attention to in the past few months or whatever, and you sent me an article about it, and maybe we could touch on here. I don't have a lot of specific case-type questions, but this one I want to touch on. That's the Big Sur case of 1964, because that's almost like a case study of what you do by, finding the whistleblowers and then trying to get past. You do a great job in the article that you sent me. And what magazine was that in?
Oh, it's in the International UFO Reporter, which is the quarterly publication of the Center for UFO Studies, QFOS. If your listeners go online and type in Big Sur UFO, Sur is S-U-R, Big Sur UFO Hastings, you'll find references, actually the entire article reprinted. It's now online. And yes, it's extraordinary. I consider it one of the top half dozen cases that I'm aware of involving UFOs and nuclear weapons that sort of substantiates the reality of it. You've got 2 key sources, retired Air Force or former or retired Air Force personnel, officers, who've gone on the record saying that in September of 1964 at Vandenberg Air Force Base in California, an Atlas missile was test launched. It was carrying an experimental payload warhead that was designed to release chaff, aluminum chaff, around the warhead up in space, which was designed to confuse Soviet radar defenses, so they would not, if they had anti-missile capability and attempted to shoot down the warhead, they would not be able to differentiate between the warhead and the chaff. So that was the purpose of the experiment. The 2 officers that former retired officers that have gone on record, Robert Jacobs, who was the chief of the photo instrumentation unit at Vandenberg, and another gentleman named Major Florence Mansman, who was one of the chief photo-optical interpreters. I don't have his exact title in my mind at the moment, but in any event, these 2 people have independently confirmed that while they were filming the launch of this missile test, and after the warhead, the dummy warhead, had separated from the booster, they actually picked up on film a UFO coming into camera frame, circling the dummy warhead at 4 different points, flashing bright lightning bolt types of beams at the warhead, whereupon, according to both officers, the warhead began to tumble and fell into the Pacific Ocean hundreds of miles short of its target. Lieutenant Jacobs has characterized this as, quote, a shot across the bow of our nuclear silliness ship, end quote. And in my view, that just hits the nail right on the head. I think that's exactly what was going on. Somebody, obviously in possession of superior technology, was demonstrating that they had the ability to interfere with nuclear weapons in space, nuclear warheads in space. Now, the organization CSICOP, the Committee for Scientific Investigation of Claims of the Paranormal, I'm sure most of your listeners have heard of them. It's been a UFO debunking group, paranormal debunking group now for decades. They published an article in 1993 by a man named Kingston George, who was also involved with this particular series of launches at Vandenberg. Kingston George claims that Lieutenant Jacobs' report about this incident was totally off base. There was nothing involving UFOs, that in fact they were simply misidentifying what they were observing on film, which was a type of decoy or dummy experiment, and these objects that were being deployed as dummy decoy warheads were misidentified as a UFO. Well, I have personally found, as I described in the article, a number of factual errors. Mr. George just totally misrepresented what Lieutenant Jacobs said about the launch, said about what was captured on film. And in my view, I've totally demolished Mr. George's skeptical debunking assessment of the case. So I think, if for no other reason, persons who are aware of Big Sur and the controversy around it, I think they would find my article quite illuminating in terms of my identifying a number of fundamental errors in the debunking treatment of the case.
Yeah, and we'll have a link up to. I'll Google that up and find it, and we'll have a link up to it on the page with the interview, so people can check that out.
Your reference to the other article that I have online at the NICAP.org website, if you search Google simply for UFO ICBM, you'll find it almost immediately. Yeah.
And like I said, we'll have all the links up. Hopefully people will be able to find them and stuff, and I'm sure they will, because we'll make it as readily available as possible. How about a ballpark figure here on how many of these UFO nuclear incidents have you actually discovered at this point? Do you have a number off the top of your head where you think you can put at?
I don't, off the top of my head. I mean, if depending on what database we're talking about, reports that were written about in declassified documents as opposed to interviews I've conducted with individuals, I don't know what the total would be. I can tell you that the number of persons that I've interviewed since 1973 who, in my view, are credible witnesses speaking about nuclear weapons-related UFO cases, the number of persons I've interviewed is approximately 60 at this point in time. The number of persons that I've interviewed about UFO sightings in general by Air Force personnel is in the range of several hundred at this point. I wouldn't be able to quantify it for you.
You've talked a lot here about UFOs sort of tinkering with the nukes, messing with the controls, or interfering in the tests and that kind of thing. Would you say that that's the predominant overarching theme of these UFO nuclear connection, or would you say that's more of a small subsection when the UFO gets proactively involved in it? Is it, is that more the norm that the UFO is going to be doing something to the nuke, or is it more often than not they're just surveying what's going on?
Again, I would have difficulty quantifying the ratio. However, I would say the overwhelming majority of the cases that I'm aware of, based on the testimony of these former and retired Air Force personnel, the majority of the cases would simply involve what one might characterize as surveillance, UFO surveillance of nuclear weapons sites. However, there is this subcategory of probably 6 or 7 cases that I'm aware of from these witness interviews where there was actually apparently deliberate, premeditated tampering or interruption of the missile's functionality. One might argue that these are simply incidental incidents, that, for example, the UFO is emanating some sort of field effect which inadvertently interferes with the missile's electronics, thereby causing the malfunction. That's indeed in the realm of possibility, but my opinion and the opinion of the majority of my sources is that no, there was a premeditated, deliberate demonstration by whoever was on board the UFO that indeed they could interfere with our nuclear weapons functionality.
You're listening to Banal of America Audio.
Great heavens! What kind of radio show is this?
And when it came out that these X-Files were still in his, were part of that archive, did the Army or anybody try and go and take those back? Because it sounds like they were like super classified.
No. Well, when I'm discovering these, and by the time I got them, I think it was 95 or so, right? Mm-hmm. Now, I mean, a generation has passed. Yeah. And at this point, Shag Harbor, isn't on your television or isn't,
Yeah.
And nobody was just doing the follow-up. And look, be honest, when I first sent these requests after I found where to do such a thing, in 93, right? Mm-hmm. And I'm writing to the Department of National Defense and to National Archives and these agencies here in Canada. Often, like when I wrote to the Department of National Defense, a few days later, a researcher on the floor called me up on the telephone and said, are you sure about this? Were we there? Did we do something? Like they were unaware, right? Now, they're aware of it now. But, at the time, nobody had looked for these, right?
Yeah.
And they were quite surprised. And I thought, well, God, this, I'll be lucky to see anything. But 2 days later, this young lady phoned me back and indeed had a dozen good documents and some other suggestions and mailed them to me. But, they were really largely sort of uninterested, right? But, and then when connections were made, other files have been found and they've been made public now. I mean, this case is quite famous. At the time, it was off everybody's radar. But, I mean, some of the young staff that were now trainees and researchers on the floor that deal with public requests were unaware of their involvement with UFOs, And at the time, remember, these departments are officially no longer involved. Kind of like the U.S. Air Force. If you just write them and you ask them, they'll say, well, we're not involved in UFO research anymore.
Yeah.
Well, certainly Blue Book was canceled. Certainly the public effort doesn't exist. But, if you're a part of certain divisions, I mean, believe me, some near collision that involves an unknown object will be investigated.
Yeah.
It may not be a UFO investigation, but, call it whatever you want. That's what it is. So, that's it. And it's a bit different now. So, but those were the glory days in the beginning. There were lots of documents. They're harder to come by, but they still surface occasionally, right? Now, there were 4 primary sources of documents from these: Department of National Defense, National Archives, the Burke Gaffney Archives. But one of the other great sources was an early APRO. That used to be the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization, and now defunct American UFO Group. Mm-hmm. There was a great preliminary report done for the late Jim Lorenzen, who headed that organization.
Yep.
And it was discovered by, again, Jan Aldrich, the researcher responsible more than anybody for Project 1947, a great resource you have in the U.S., right? Mm-hmm. And he found this, and he sent it right to me. And it actually had the most detailed report of all, because that local APRO investigator got on the phone in the early days before there was any censoring, and would just, went as best he could at every spokesman and every person and got them to talk. And there was, it's actually one of the fourth, and perhaps in some ways one of the more important resources we use to get the details.
Yeah.
And those details, it's great they were written down, Tim, because something, you find witnesses today, and memory's a very plastic, soft thing, right? Yeah. Even the divers, and I'd seen their name on some of the orders, they were there, they couldn't even remember the year. And they were trying to be helpful,
Yeah.
I mean, these guys, you remember, they were told to forget it, loose lips sink ships, the Cold War's on,
Yeah.
It's hard to believe, but they couldn't even remember the year, and they guessed 62 when it was 67, this kind of thing. And these are people that are trying to be helpful. So when anybody writes something down, you go with that written record, in the press or the statement at the time, because believe me, memory, it's a very soft thing. We've all gone back to that hill that we used to sled down and are just amazed how small it is, how big it is in our memory, right? So,
exactly.
Yeah.
And then you alluded to here what seems to be what has come out in the last 10 years since you've been doing the research is that there was more going on in that area than they thought at the time. That even though it looked like there was just a search going on at Shag Harbor, there was also another search going on about 25 miles away, northwest, I believe. Mm-hmm. Why don't you talk about that Shelburne search, because it sounds like that's the one that really was the UFO search.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the problems with the Shag Harbor incident is that, it was some time before Navy divers were on the scene, right? And certainly all the other UFO incidents, and some who weren't reported, were quickly pushed aside, and Shag Harbor became forefront to the media's attention, right? Mm-hmm. they first arrived on the scene on Friday, October the 6th, and they dove all day that day. Now, this was a low-tech search. These were divers that were from what was known as the Fleet Diving Unit in Halifax.
Yep.
Also known as the Granby Divers. Their designation on their hats would have been HMCS Granby, Her Majesty's Canadian Ship Granby, which was one of the big diving tenders. They didn't take that down there. They hired a local boat after they had a Coast Guard boat for the first day. And look, they dove. It was basically, the effort was pairs of divers going down together with flashlights. Okay, there were 7 of them all together, and they kept this up through the daylight hours. They laid out a grid pattern that ran from the initial impact site to the last known surface position. Now, the world watched this. There was, film footage that was on CBC television news in the day, and lots of people sitting around the shoreline watching this effort. But in some ways, this played into the authorities' hands, I believe, because, look, Canada in 1967 wasn't New Mexico in 47. You just couldn't push everybody away and say nothing here, or, go home, or, cordon off the area, right? Yeah. Things were more open. And the thing is, in some ways it played into their hands, because it's been suggested to me that what better way to cover up a UFO attempted recovery operation 25 miles away than have everybody in the world looking at a UFO crash site, which they're going to want to do.
Yeah.
Mind you, they had to search there anyway. There could have been debris, unique trauma to the bottom, other things that I still look for in 1995 when I did my underwater search with sightings. But the real story, unknown to the public, I was told, according to the divers, was 25 miles away, less than a mile offshore from the Shelburne base, which, as I said earlier, was a coordination center for submarine detection in the Atlantic. Ships quickly assembled over there, and what they saw on the bottom when divers went down and dropped cameras was 2 objects there, one loaning assistance to the other, and they described there being activity of some beings down there. Once this was detected, they were told simply to observe and not interfere. They did so for a week, at which time these objects began to move, went down the coast of the Gulf of Maine, surfaced, and flew away. Now, none of that Shelburne story has the documentation of the Shag Harbor crash site or the belief or search for a UFO there, right?
Yeah.
But there are secondary things that show that this story could very well be true. Like I mentioned earlier, some of the X-Files allude that there was indeed a second search, though it wasn't publicly known or admitted to, okay? The other thing is that exactly 1 week later, to the hour, 2 sets of lights are seen coming up out of the water in Shag Harbor and flying away. And that was reported, and Mountie saw that again, too. So, it fits the diver's story like a glove, right?
Yeah.
And I actually got that story from them before I had these documents or knew of the second sighting. And by the way, even that second sighting made the National Enquirer. So, it wasn't just some little thing I found and made it fit, right?
Yeah.
So those things, although they're not official, do tend to support the diver's story of the second simultaneous search effort. But again, bear in mind, there's nothing official. Look, we have tons of documents that say, yes, the government believed UFO crashed in Shag Harbor. Many people seen it, including Mountie's, and we searched. The Shelburne story at this point is only a story, but there were certainly documents that allude there was a second search area, though there is no official paperwork to back that part up.
And can you extrapolate on what the diver said about the creatures working on the object and beings being down there? I'm sure that's obviously pretty sensational stuff. So, what kind of details?
That part of the testimony from them to me was in a personal interview, face to face, and there was witnesses there with me that heard this. I wasn't alone, and they had trouble talking about that, because as they said, that was the black box aspect of the case, right?
Yeah.
And they were very reluctant, and it was a bit like pulling teeth, but. The way they put it is there was no doubt. We were down there. That was no Russian sub. That was no experimental thing. That whatever it wasn't from here.
Yeah.
And once we seen it, we're that close, we were told, that's, we went up and reported that, and they were saying, well, don't do nothing. Leave the cameras down there. Eventually, apparently, 400 feet of film were shot, which, of course, we don't have, And I was even told who the naval photographer was, and I went to his door in Ottawa. And all he said, he would add nothing to it. He said, whatever they told you is true. Close the door. Well, what they simply said was there was activity on there. We seen beings, and they were going. And when you tried to get more detail out of them, it was weird. Obviously, it bothered these guys, and it was hard to tell whether the sort of pain in talking about that they were suffering had to do with maybe they were violating some security oath, or it's just traumatic. I often had the impression that perhaps something happened down there and there was loss of life, because these guys did some pretty nasty work, hauling dead bodies that have crashed airplanes, and they love to talk that kind of stuff. And if there is such a thing as Iron Men, they were it. And yet they had trouble talking about this.
And did they ever describe the creatures or the beings?
No,
nothing like that.
No. And when you push them in that direction, they would look at the floor and sort of wave their hand, like appeared to be troubled.
Wow.
Yeah. No, this is like 26 years later. I found them, right.
Yeah.
And like I said, these are guys that they haul their coworkers dead out of planes, and like a diver does some pretty unsavory work at times.
Oh, definitely, yeah.
And this seemed to be difficult to talk about.
And you have no idea where that film ended up, huh? They don't even.
Well, no. There's no. The whole trick to finding these files, even the paperwork, is coming up with file names and locations, right?
Yeah.
No. But from that year, there is still a secret file in Ottawa, and we know this because when I was in Ottawa, and in '93, I did an on-site search there for paper records that could not be transferred to Halifax, that are kept, in reference only.
Yeah.
And just before I went to look at the last box in a section of files that was called Records Group 24, before I could see it, they assessed that box. It went across the street to a military section that goes through it again. And when I got the box, it was described to be as being quite sizable, and I knew how big the file was. When I opened it up, there was only a few files in it, and there was a yellow piece of paper in the bottom attached to the draw sheet, and on that it actually said, this file has been sanitized, and it had the officer's name and date on it. It was that day, right? And right on it, it listed things that were taken, and one of the files taken actually said, it was called, believe it or not, it said UFO Crash 1967, target detection and search and acquisition. It said 1967, and it had a line drawn through it, and it said top secret, not to be released. So, I wonder what event that was, and I never did get that one. I don't know if it was a piece of paper or film or what it was, but it was listed as were many other documents that I'm not sure their title didn't reveal what they were, but strangely enough that one did. UFO Crash 1967, target detection and acquisition. Well, there was one other thing. It had a coding number on it. This is really quite funny, and sometimes government departments can be a real hoot when you do this work. It had a coding number. I didn't know what it meant. I can still remember the number. It said -3800-10-1. And then after that, it had DRBS. And I assume the DRBS meant Defense Research Board here in Canada. So when I got out of that, I called the Defense Research Board, right?
Yeah.
And I had some person that was sitting on the computer for lunch for somebody, and asked them if they could just tell me what that number meant. And they tapped into the computer and they go, isn't that weird? They go, that's a UFO with both radar and visual detection.
Huh.
So, considering it said, the operation and acquisition and everything, I guess that means they got it or tried or,
Yeah.
Right? But pretty strange. But, despite the fact that so much of this is open and it's very different than what we usually see in these UFO crash scenarios, there is a black box aspect to this case, and there is a thing that there are things we have yet to get, okay?
Yeah.
And may never, of course, but it's out there.
And when the Shag Harbor incident happened, how extensive was the U.S. involvement in this? Because obviously there seems to be sort of the idea that they would work hand in hand with the UFO.
Well, they did, and there was a lot of cooperation, and it only made sense. Like, bear in mind, again, let's look at the background. You have 2 U.S. bases on Canadian soil in that corner of Nova Scotia, right? The former Canadian Forces Station Barrington at Back Row, which was a NORAD radar facility, that end of the Pine Tree line, since it's just automated. Everybody knows about the Dew line, but there's a Mid-Canada line and a Pine Tree line. Back Row was that end of the Pine Tree line. And just a few miles away, you had Shelburne, and that was the coordination center for submarine detection in the Atlantic. It was hard linked with Argentia, Newfoundland, and Key West, Florida, and they had microphoned the whole Atlantic Ocean.
Oh, wow.
And they also had a grid out there called the MAD grid, stood for Magnetic Anomaly Detection. So I imagine they knew where this thing was and where it moved. So, so I'm sure that by the time the Navy divers reached Shag Harbor, they told me they knew it wasn't there anymore.
Yeah.
But they had to look there too. There might have been debris, there might have been this. Again, the research, according to them, was going on in Shelburne. Now, this is according to them. I don't have that on paper. We do know they were looking in Shag Harbor. The divers tell me they were also looking in Shelburne. So American involvement, you have those two bases here. They were involved in the search effort, right? I mean, our shared defense out over the Gulf of Maine. At the time, there was a U.S. carrier group there practicing for Vietnam. They got involved in the search and flew high-altitude missions over and took photos from there. And that was admitted in that Apple report. The spokesman was named, the officer that admitted it. It's all in that, the one that we gained from Jan Aldrich there, right?
Yeah.
So they were searching, right? People that were flying aircraft over the area and dropping sonar buoys in the search for this in the next few days talk about they were doing more interaction into American airspace than usual, and their planes were entering ours, going back and forth to try to make a complete search grid, right? Now, those things would happen occasionally in search and rescue. They used to have to ask for clearance for each time you passed in. That had been waived, and they were freely moving between your and our airspace here, right?
Yeah.
So it was an exceptional thing. There were certain people who were brought off course here in Nova Scotia from another base that were brought into the search effort. So, they were looking. They were looking hard, and many of those aspects like that involved U.S. staff, right? Like I say, those bases at the time were actually a shared facility. Before 1962, they would have flown the American flag only.
Yeah.
And in 67, those bases flew both Old Glory and Canada's, at that time, almost new flag. And, it was a 50-50 staff basis, set up through NORAD, right? But, so you had American personnel looking from the two bases. You had American personnel from bases in Maine and from that carrier group flying over the area. So, lots of U.S. involvement. Then when you look at the change of story, one of the only people who ever changed the story, the lightkeeper on Bon Portage Island now claims that he did find an artifact and turned it over to U.S. officials under orders of the Canadian Coast Guard. And I am still trying to find if that's indeed the case, if there was notes in his logbook or whatever. The Canadian Coast Guard claims to have lost all those records. That's their official stance, and I have paperwork in the cover letter saying that. But that's continuing, and in fact, I'm about to start an effort where I make a complaint about that, and we'll see where that takes us. I'll start with the Information Commissioner. It could potentially be a court case within a year, so I don't know. But I mean, this is still an active investigation. The case remains open and unsolved. And the official stance in the paperwork is still that they were searching for a UFO and they didn't get it. And there was no reason to think it was anything conventional.
One of the things that Stan Friedman talks about with the Roswell case is the race with the Undertaker, if you will, trying to get witnesses before they pass on. And obviously you have a 20-year advantage, I guess, on that because the Shag Harbor incident occurred in 67, not 47 like Roswell. So maybe you have less of a problem with that. But time is going forward, so it's obviously going to become a problem. But how do you deal with that? And are there new witnesses coming forward?
Well, yeah, there are. I mean, and as lucky as we've been and as much work as myself and people like Don Ledger have done, there are still people we'd like to have talked to that, have yet to be located, or sometimes it takes a few years for them to change their mind and be willing to talk, right? We haven't quite had a race against the Undertaker. It's been a concern, and a couple times that problem has reared its ugly head. For the most part, not, because, like I say, when I started, we had a 20-year advantage on when Roswell was first looked into, right?
Yeah.
Unfortunately, when it has occurred, it's been a problem at some bad times. For example, one of the people I would have loved to have chatted with was the former commanding officer of the Shelburne base, and when I finally located him, other members of his family took the phone to tell me he passed away 3 days before.
Oh, man.
Unfortunate. That's one of the few times it was like in a real key position like that, right?
Yeah.
But for the most part, no. I mean, I have talked to all three of the RCMP officers on the scene, the 7 reporting eyewitnesses that initially reported, the 3 men who were on the first Coast Guard boat to respond. In fact, just days ago, I spoke to one of them. And, we've been lucky, and of course, many of them, and there's a huge amount of non-reporting witnesses.
Yeah.
And in fact, it's interesting, the Shag Harbor incident falls into that ideal ratio. You know, UFO researchers would often tell you that for every witness that reports, you'll find 10 that didn't.
Mm-hmm.
7 reported initially that night, and on last count, my witness interview list is up around 70.
Oh, wow.
Of those who, you know, seen it firsthand, right? So there's been a couple of key times when, yes, the Undertaker, you know, issue has come up. You know, the people are no longer with us I would like to talk to. For the most part, though, it's not near the problem it's been in Roswell. And we have found most of the people we wanted to.
Yeah.
And so, you know, and that was a blessing.
And then as the principal investigator of the Shag Harbor incident, the guy who really kind of put it on the map, how much do you have to deal with ill-informed media getting involved, the skeptics who always seem to conveniently get the facts wrong when they debunk the cases,
right,
and that kind of stuff? I mean, does that get on your nerves, and how often do you have to deal with that?
It happens occasionally. I like to think I've gotten better at dealing with it. It's not a big problem, right? Most people, if they do the research or look at this case, realize that it was something serious and it's been treated serious, right?
Yeah.
There hasn't been, you know, it hasn't been attacked. Was it Stant likes to call it noisy negativists?
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, look, when I've given lectures in the U.S., I've been surprised. I've been almost disappointed, to be honest, but few have tackled me. I think they realize when they hear me speak, I'm fairly well researched. My memory's largely intact, right? And, you know, when they point out something, you have a question, I can usually answer it, right?
Yeah.
And, you know, for somebody that tries to make a ridiculous statement, I love to crush the question when I can, and I often can, you know. If I don't know something, I'm not afraid to say I don't know, or if I made a mistake. And I think that's helped. But look, there's not been a lot of that. When it does happen, it's usually the result of somebody wanting to do a very limited segment on it, you know, as part of, under the umbrella of some silly show, you know, on the paranormal or something.
Yeah.
In which case I usually don't get involved. But I've yet to have anybody attack it or completely dismiss it. I mean, there have been better and poorer treatments of the subject matter. But for me, it's not a big problem. And, you know, if they come at me silly, they start realizing it's serious. And if they look at the material, they realize it is. It's not a big issue. But, you know, you deal with those things. The other thing is I'm kind of prepared now. When somebody asks a question or they want to do a treatment, you know, I have answers and overviews that fit a 1-minute treatment, a 5-minute treatment, or an hour treatment, you know, and I think I've gotten better at giving what they want, you know. I mean, that helps too, but I mean, there are people I say no to occasionally. And it's usually because, you know, they're trying to boil it down just too much, or it's under the umbrella of something silly, you know. I mean, you know,
exactly.
That happens. It's not been a big issue, you know, to be honest. Not for me, but when you get somebody calling they're irritating, they know how to do it, you know. Yeah.
One of the things we were talking about before we went on the air was this new, I guess it's new now, new case in Prince Edward Island, which is where my family has I have a lot of family up there and vacation time a lot up in PEI. So